May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. Well, you can take a pill now, apparently. Researchers say that will extend your life for 10 years. Well, except the pill won't be ready for 10 years. Whether we are skeptical about advances in science in terms of prolonging life, Nigel Hawkes from the London Times asked the question, well, if we can prolong life, will it be a life worth living? Kind of opening statement in the book A Life Worth Living by Nicky Gumbel. And during this fall season, we'll have a chance to study this book for those who are here on Wednesday's midweek service after that and Thursday evenings. Or if you want to just pick up a copy and read it for yourself, that's worth doing. We've ordered a number of them and they'll be coming in shortly. A Life Worth Living. The first part of the series, as Nicky outlines and fits in so well with this whole study in the book of Philippians, is that the life worth living is possible because Jesus gives us a new heart. A new heart of compassion, of confidence, of concern for others. And it's a miracle, really, that is possible. Because of his death and resurrection, it's possible to have that new heart that God gives us. So instead of just having a prolonged life, we have a life worth living. An elderly lady arrived at the funeral home for her husband's funeral, and the director of the funeral home met her at the door and said, your husband was a good age. How old was he? And she said, well, he was 98, just a couple years older than me. And he said to her, well, so you're 96. And after the service, she said, well, yes, I am 96. I guess there's hardly any point in going home. But in any case, a life worth living can happen at any stage of our life. That new heart is possible for any of us. So let's look at this passage. You have it in front of you there, and I've printed it in the leaflet if you want to follow along. Paul is in Philippi, and he's there with, when he's writing the letter, he says it's Paul and Timothy. When Paul and Silas, at the time when he arrives in Philippi, three things happen and that make it possible for this a life worth living with this new heart for three different people. Paul arrives in Philippi and he's looking, as he often does, for where the Jewish worshipers are gathering. And because it's a city of Gentiles, of mostly non-Jewish people who are traders, it's an important city between a couple of mountain ranges. There's a road that passes through there. In the time of Alexander the Great, he named it after his father, Philip. That's why it's called Philippi. Philip II, actually, the second Philippi. And there was a lot of gold and silver there. It was being mined. It was an important economic, cultural, and commerce center. Paul arrives there, but there are very few Jews. So the Jews who are there, they worship outside, in this case, by a river. It would be like walking over to Soper Creek here in Bowmanville and seeing some people gathering for prayers on a Saturday. Paul arrives there. He sees these women, and he is introduced to Lydia, and she is a trader in purple cloth, as you can read in Acts chapter 16. And she is converted to Christ. God is on her heart for worship, and Paul says, well, this God whom you have known through the Old Testament scriptures, through the Hebrew scriptures, has been made known as the Messiah, as Jesus. She comes to Christ. She and her family, they're baptized in the river, and he is invited to stay in her home. That's the first miracle of conversion. The second one is after a number of days, this fortune teller is following Paul around and saying, you are a follower of the Holy One of God. Listen to him because he's trying to save you. Listen to him, he's trying to save you. She kept repeating this over and over again from Acts chapter 16. You can read about this. It's very annoying for Paul. Eventually he turns around, commands the spirit to come out of this young lady. She's healed, and of course the people who were controlling her, who were the slave owners, are upset. And again, the power of God, they're eventually put in jail. Paul and Silas are. There's an earthquake. They're freed from that, but instead of escaping, they bring the jailer, the prison officer, to come to Christ, and he and his whole family are saved. So these three miraculous events happen in Philippi, and that's the beginning of the church in Philippi. Again, you can read about it in Acts chapter 6. So when Paul says, grace and peace to you, and he says, I thank my God every time I remember you in all of my prayers for everyone, because of your share in the gospel from the first day until now. There was a first day. That was the first day. And it was an awesome first day of planting a church. It was an awesome first day. Conversion of a sophisticated woman, leader of the church, a slave girl who was from a lower economic class, freed up spiritually, and then this sort of middle class prison official. So all three classes of society, male and female, that was the first day. What a way to plant a church. So the power of God is there, and a new heart is given to each of these three people and their families, and that's recorded in Acts 16, but we can read sort of the summary of it in Philippians chapter 1. So this new heart is possible and has an effect, as Paul is letting us know about. The effect of that, of course, is that it isn't just for Paul's readers in Philippi, because he's actually writing the letter while he's in prison. Hence he says, both during my imprisonment and in the defense. So he's actually writing from prison in Rome, sometime later, writing the letter to the Christians in Philippi. Have you ever thought of the letter to the Philippians this way? That it is actually a thank you note. It's a thank you note for the support the Philippians have sent to Paul while he's in prison in Rome. So from that point of view, we see the encouragement in it. The word joy is used 16 times in the letter to the Philippians, and it's certainly evident in Paul's letter. I thank my God every time I think of him, constantly in joy. He's just almost overwhelmed with thankfulness and praise to God. So this has an effect as people read about this, not just as a historic letter from many years ago, but something that, because of who Jesus is today, continues to have an effect. One of Nicky Gumbel's friends, Carrie, was a missionary in 1992 in the Philippines, and he and a team went to a remote village outside of the capital city of the Philippines, and they wanted to share the good news and love of God and Jesus. When they had to bring 2 translators with them because they had to go from English into the Filipino language, and then from that Filipino language to the Taboli language, which is from English to Cebuano to Taboli. So they had to bring all these translators in order to... So when they got to the village, and the villagers came out, about 50 of them came out to see what was going on, they brought a blind man in front of Carrie and said, okay, if you believe in God, and this Jesus is the embodiment of God, show us. This is a blind man who's respected by his community and been blind from birth. So Carrie prayed in the confidence and love of God and prayed for him to receive his sight. And through the translator asked him, well, what can you see? And the man said, well, I can see little sparkles. And so Carrie prayed again. He prayed a second time. In the name of Jesus, he would be healed. And this time he said, well, I can see your outline, through the translator. I can see your outline, but it's still not clear. Third time, Carrie prays for him, that the blindness would be gone, he would receive new sight. And in that moment, they didn't need a translator, because he was jumping up and down with praise because he could now see. Jesus had healed him in that very... So all 50 people came to Christ, and the church continues to grow, Nicky reports in his book, A Life Worth Living. What has happened in our lives, we might think as circumstances or just happenstance. If God is completing something in you, He's got a good work going on in you. He's completing it. He's helping make it continue to happen. That the healing process sometimes happens miraculously right away, and sometimes it takes time to have that kind of insight, to have the ability to, or to even have that confidence. Like to hear Betty, you know, when I first met you, you wouldn't have been able to stand up and say what you just said this morning. Like something's going on in you, which is wonderful. It's a new confidence and a faith Betty was saying that she won the county prize for public speaking in grade 8, and God was preparing her to be able to speak some more, and it's so great to see that happening, and you're giving thanks to God for what's happened, regardless of the terrible circumstances of the fire. But you're not talking about the trauma of the fire, you're talking about what God has done, all these wonderful things, the nativity scene of your son who died at age 30, and he was somehow protected except for the couple of figures, and even those were instructive. So the power of God power of God has that effect in our life to help us complete the good work in partnership with Him, in fellowship with Him. And when we fall out of fellowship, the relationship's still there, but we need to confess and come back to Him and have that close walk with Him on a daily basis. Sometimes it takes terrible things to happen to remind us about how close He is with us, to remind us that He has given us a new heart. Grow into that confidence and grow into that compassion, grow into that concern for others. We'll be learning more about that as we look at Philippians chapter 1, verses 20 to 37. I think it's the end of chapter 1 next week, when we look from having this new heart that God gives us in Jesus to having a new purpose in life. From that heart of following Jesus, all He's given us, to having a new purpose in life. So we'll look forward to talking more about that with you next week. Thanks be to God.